Winter brings out the best in humanity, mainly our ability to panic the moment the temperature drops below sweater weather. Suddenly, basic driving turns into a survival ritual designed by people who fear snowflakes. And trust me, whatever you've seen on the roads is nothing compared to what's coming next. 1. In one northern town, a winter driving rule requires every driver to keep a full-sized snow shovel in the car for emergency extraction, which sounds sensible until noticing the fine print demanding the shovel be visibly displayed at all times. This means drivers have taken to propping their shovels in the passenger seat like a deranged carpool companion, buckled in for safety and staring out the window like it's contemplating escape. One man even painted eyes on his to avoid failure to maintain shovel visibility, a violation that carries a higher penalty than blocking a fire hydrant. Nothing says functional government like valuing a gardening tool's comfort over the lives of actual humans on the road. The police chief defended the rule by saying it encourages winter preparedness, which is a polite way of admitting they've accidentally created a seasonal puppet show only visible from car windows. 2. A Midwestern county once mandated that during snowfall, drivers must honk their horn every 30 seconds to alert unseen pedestrians, which turned downtown traffic into something between a shipyard and a goose migration. According to the ordinance, the honking schedule had to be consistent and unwavering, resulting in drivers obsessively watching the clock, terrified of being caught honk late and fined for failure to emit. One woman reported that her daily commute transformed into a stress test, usually reserved for submarine captains, except instead of listening for sonar pings, she was responsible for creating them. The absurdity escalated when locals discovered the rule applied even when no pedestrians had been spotted for days, effectively turning the entire region into a winter-themed car alarm symphony. Officials later admitted the rule was drafted by someone who had a strong personal passion for safety, apparently unaware that forcing everyone to honk through a blizzard is the sort of policy that convinces people to move to Florida immediately. 3. A coastal city with exactly 0 mountains somehow implemented a winter driving law requiring all vehicles to carry chains, regardless of altitude or likelihood of icy terrain, which is an elegant way of saying the city council panicked after a single frosty morning. Residents now spend December explaining to confused tourists why cars are clinking around town like medieval knights commuting to work. One delivery driver was fined for improper chain enthusiasm because he simply stored them in his trunk instead of wearing them like everyone else, prompting the police to enlighten him about the spirit of the law. The whole setup feels like a Renaissance fair that escaped into modern traffic patterns, with SUVs clattering down flat, dry roads under the watchful eye of officers who know full well the rule makes no sense, but enforce it anyway, because winter has a way of breaking people's will to argue. The city eventually admitted the law dates back to an overzealous council member who visited Colorado once and never emotionally recovered. 4. In a region famous for overreacting to weather, a local ordinance requires drivers to clear not only their windshields and roofs, but also the tops of their side mirrors, to ensure aerodynamic harmony, a phrase that should be framed and displayed in a museum of bureaucratic poetry. The rule was born after someone's small chunk of mirror ice flew off and tapped another car, causing approximately 0 damage, but sparking a legislative frenzy typically reserved for natural disasters. Drivers now find themselves scraping ice off surfaces no human has ever bothered inspecting, crouched in the driveway like they're defusing a frosty explosive. One man received a citation because his mirror still had residual winter presence, a term so vague it could apply to anything from a snowflake to seasonal depression. The town insists the policy improves safety, though the only measurable outcome has been people developing an unusually deep resentment toward mirrors and the committees that worship them. 5. One community's winter rulebook includes the brilliant requirement that drivers must keep headlights on during any condition in which atmospheric shimmer is present, a phrase so subjective it might as well be determined by astrology. Officers have become amateur meteorologists, pulling people over to debate whether the air looks shimmery enough for illumination citations. A man once argued that what the officer saw was not shimmer but dignified haze, which apparently was not a recognized atmospheric category and earned him an extra fine for semantic noncompliance. The real comedy lies in the fact that shimmer is observed differently depending on whether one has had coffee, slept poorly, or simply holds resentment toward the sky. This has turned lighting enforcement into a mood-based sport, with drivers nervously guessing whether the universe looks sparkly enough today. Local officials refuse to clarify the wording because ambiguity, they claim, encourages mindfulness. If mindfulness means white-knuckled existential panic about the glow level of the atmosphere, they've succeeded. 6. In one snow-prone township, a winter driving rule states that any car unable to reach a full stop within 3 snowflakes of distance is subject to ticketing, which is the kind of measurement system one expects from a children's book written during a fever dream. Officers insist this metric is perfectly enforceable because they know snowflakes when they see them fall, which is comforting only if you enjoy laws based on the rotational whims of frozen water. One driver challenged the ticket by asking the officer to define the size of the snowflake in question, prompting the officer to claim that all snowflakes are legally identical, a statement that would make meteorologists burst into flames. As a result, drivers began memorizing snowfall rates like they were studying for a weather-themed game show, terrified of being caught braking at the wrong molecular interval. It's a stunning demonstration of how a simple stop can become a mathematical hostage crisis when local government gets too creative. 7. A northern mountain town passed a law requiring drivers to roll down their window and verbally announce any turn they are about to make if temperatures drop below freezing because blinkers may become sluggish in winter, a claim unsupported by science but very popular among residents who enjoy hearing strangers shout directional intentions like they're auctioneers. The rule has led to surreal roadside theater, with drivers yelling things like, "Left turn in 3, 2," while pedestrians watch with the quiet resignation of people living in a place that fully surrendered logic decades ago. One man claimed he lost his voice after commuting during a cold snap and attempted to use hand puppets to communicate his turns, which earned him a citation for unapproved gesture signaling. The police maintain the rule improves safety, though the only real achievement has been transforming traffic flow into an unrequested live audio tour, narrated by people slowly losing their grip on dignity and patience. 8. In a lakeside region famous for overprotective winter policies, the law requires every car to drive at half speed whenever snow touches the ground, even if the snowfall consists of a single rogue flake drifting lazily toward Earth like it's on vacation. This rule has resulted in highway traffic slowing to a crawl anytime the weather shows the faintest sign of seasonal enthusiasm. One driver was reportedly fined for failing to reduce speed after what the officer described as a proactive snowflake, which turned out to be lint floating near a street lamp. Residents have adapted by scanning the sky with the intensity of astronomers watching for comets, knowing that one drifting crystal could transform the express lane into a slow-motion parade. Officials defend the rule by insisting it prevents winter accidents, though the only measurable effect has been commuters arriving 3 hours late and blaming atmospheric debris. The town seems determined to prove that speed limits, like hope, should be the first casualties of winter. 9. A rural county passed a winter ordinance that forbids drivers from using windshield wipers until an appropriate accumulation threshold has been achieved, a phrase that sounds important but was never actually defined. Enforcement is largely based on vibes, with officers pulling people over because their wipers seemed prematurely optimistic. One woman was cited for activating hers during what she called snow, but the officer described as gentle seasonal confetti, which apparently did not meet the town's strict emotional criteria for precipitation. The law has created an ongoing standoff between motorists who want to see the road and a rulebook that prefers to wait until vision becomes a theoretical construct. The result is drivers squinting through ice crystal mosaics, trying to avoid both accidents and fines from officials who believe wiping your windshield too early somehow offends winter itself. If clarity is a crime here, the town seems proud to be policing it. 10. In one especially inventive municipality, winter driving regulations require every driver to maintain a courtesy snow buffer, meaning they must leave a 4-car length gap behind vehicles that appear emotionally burdened by winter. This classification is determined by officers trained to evaluate whether a car seems to be struggling with seasonal fatigue, which is as scientific as diagnosing depression in a toaster. One man received a citation after following a minivan deemed visibly overwhelmed by slush, prompting an official note explaining that emotional respect for weather-stressed vehicles is fundamental to community harmony. Residents now treat certain cars like delicate migrating animals, giving them wide berths while whispering encouragement. Of course, none of this affects actual traffic safety, but it does create an elaborate winter ballet of vehicles tiptoeing around one another like they're afraid of hurting each other's feelings. The only real outcome is that tailgating has been replaced with a surreal level of politeness bordering on performance art. 11. A city with a history of over-engineering. Its policies created a winter rule requiring drivers to announce their presence at every blind corner by briefly activating their hazard lights, which turns residential neighborhoods into a strobe-lit holiday rave hosted by people who just want to get to work. The policy originated after a minor fender bender between two drivers who both insisted the other materialized like a ghost, leading lawmakers to conclude that hazard lights were the solution to metaphysical confusion. The resulting spectacle involves cars blinking aggressively at every intersection as pedestrians look on, wondering if they've wandered into a caution-themed nightclub. One woman was fined for insufficiently enthusiastic hazard signaling, a charge that suggests emotional investment is now a measurable traffic requirement. The city insists the rule reduces accidents, but so far the only proven effect has been disorienting joggers and making every late-night drive feel like an unsolicited light therapy session. 12. A frost-heavy region implemented a winter law demanding that drivers lower their speed by exactly 17% when temperatures fall below freezing, a number chosen not by scientists, but by a committee that reportedly liked how it sounded. Officers now carry laminated conversion charts because no one can be expected to calculate percentage reductions while skidding across black ice. One man received a ticket for reducing his speed by 15% instead of 17%, prompting the officer to explain that precision is vital to winter safety, as if the cold were monitoring math accuracy. Residents have become amateur accountants, scribbling fractions on their dashboards to avoid fines for speeding, underspeeding, or doing math that displeases local authorities. The rule hasn't prevented accidents, but it has created a generation of drivers who now associate winter with emotional flashbacks to high school algebra. If the goal was seasonal trauma, the committee nailed it. 13. A particularly enthusiastic northern village passed a law requiring all drivers to honk once when approaching snowplows as a gesture of mutual acknowledgement, which has transformed winter mornings into a bizarre symphony of polite car-to-snowplow greetings. Plow operators report being serenaded by hundreds of half-hearted horn taps from vehicles that seem embarrassed by the whole ordeal, while drivers receive fines for failure to greet winter maintenance personnel with auditory respect. One SUV owner was cited because his horn was considered too aggressive for salutation purposes, forcing him to schedule a vehicle inspection to prove he wasn't trying to intimidate a plow. Officials argue the rule fosters community spirit, though the only observable cultural shift has been motorists treating plows like important dignitaries who must be ceremonially acknowledged before passing. It's part traffic law, part seasonal etiquette class, and entirely proof that winter slowly erodes the collective sanity of governing bodies. 14. A snowy city famous for micromanagement requires drivers to brush snow off their license plates every time they park, even if they only stepped away from their car long enough to buy gum. Officers patrol parking lots, hunting for flakes that dare settle on government-issued digits, issuing fines for identity obscuration by negligent accumulation. Residents have taken to carrying handheld brooms specifically for plate maintenance, performing rapid-fire brushing rituals that make them look like nervous contestants in a very boring cooking show. One driver argued that a single snowflake does not constitute obscuration, prompting an officer to declare, "Any flake is a fraudulent disguise," which would be poetic if it weren't about license plates. The rule has achieved nothing except encouraging people to develop intense, irrational grudges against weather that behaves exactly as weather always has. Bureaucracy doesn't fight winter, it just finds people who lose the fight faster. 15. A cold weather state crafted a winter rule demanding that drivers keep their windows cracked open to maintain airflow equilibrium, which sounds scientific until realizing it was written by someone who apparently confuses cars with Victorian mansions suffering from ghost problems. The rule claims that trapped warm air can distort visibility, though the only distortion anyone has reported is their face freezing into a permanent expression of disbelief. One man received a citation because his window gap measured insufficiently breezy, forcing him to defend himself with the kind of tape measure evidence usually reserved for carpenters. Drivers now cruise through blizzards with tiny slits open in their windows, letting Arctic wind blast their cabins like they're trying to fridge freeze themselves for medical research. Officials maintain that the rule enhances safety, though the only measurable effect has been widespread hypothermic rage and a booming black market in heated seat covers. Winter didn't ask for this. People made it weird. 16. One town insists that during winter, drivers must keep their windshield washer fluid emotionally balanced, meaning the reservoir must contain exactly equal parts antifreeze and water, because someone on the council once heard that overly confident fluid can cause aggressive spray patterns. This rule has forced drivers to treat their washer fluid like it's attending therapy, carefully measuring out ratios with the seriousness of medieval alchemists. One man was fined because his mix leaned to antifreeze, a phrase that sounds like criticism for a cocktail rather than a vehicle maintenance choice. Officers carry tiny color charts to judge fluid balance, squinting like wine tasters deciding whether your car smells more like responsible adulthood or unregulated chaos. The logic behind the rule claims it prevents streaking, but the only streaking happening is the emotional kind, as people realize they now need measuring cups to legally clean their windshield. Winter used to be about survival. Now it's about maintaining your car's hydration feelings. 17. A frigid city with a deep commitment to nonsense demands that every driver carry a reflective blanket in the passenger seat all winter long, not for emergencies, but so the blanket can serve as a visual indicator of preparedness. Residents have essentially been deputized into conducting seasonal fashion shows for emergency supplies, arranging their blankets so they drape elegantly across the seat like glamorous co-pilots. One woman was fined because her blanket was insufficiently visible, as if the officer wanted to critique her interior design choices rather than enforce a traffic law. The city claims this encourages safety awareness, though it mostly encourages people to stage their cars like doomsday-themed Instagram posts. Drivers now agonize over blanket placement, color coordination, and whether they've given off the correct emotional message of readiness. If winter ever becomes sentient, it will at least appreciate the effort everyone is putting into accessorizing. 18. A mountain border town implemented a rule requiring drivers to turn off their radios during snowfall, so they may better hear winter approaching, which is deeply poetic and utterly unhinged. This law effectively transforms cars into silent meditation chambers every time the sky decides to exfoliate the earth. Officers patrol for offenders by listening at stoplights like sound technicians waiting for cues, issuing tickets for oral interference with seasonal awareness. One man tried arguing that he could, in fact, hear winter just fine over soft jazz, but the officer insisted the subtle crackle of snowflakes cannot compete with saxophones. Now, commuters ride through storms in uncomfortable quiet, hyper-aware of every tire crunch and their own intrusive thoughts. The town believes this rule builds mindfulness, but it mostly builds resentment toward weather that refuses to be subtle. Winter doesn't care if drivers are listening, it shows up loudly either way. 19. In a plains region obsessed with precision, the winter driving code states that cars cannot exceed a recommended snow spray arc, meaning any slush kicked up by your tires must fall within an imaginary geometric boundary, apparently based on the belief that water displacement is a moral choice. Officers have mastered the art of analyzing tire spray like forensic hydrologists, assessing crime scenes made entirely of melting filth. One driver was fined because his truck created an unethical splash trajectory, which is a phrase that should disqualify someone from holding public office, but instead earned enthusiastic nods from the safety committee. Residents now accelerate with the gentle caution of people defusing a bomb made of damp snow, all terrified that one enthusiastic puddle burst will get them labeled a winter menace. The rule has done nothing for road safety, but has elevated slush to a kind of performance art judged by people with clipboards. 20. A Chile municipality passed a rule demanding that drivers exiting parking lots must stop twice during winter, once at the sign and once to acknowledge potential hidden hazards, including but not limited to frost goblins, a phrase that is technically whimsical but legally binding. Officers claim it encourages respect for unseen dangers, though most drivers suspect it encourages revenue collection and group hallucination. One man was written up for performing his second stop without contemplative pause, implying the city expects drivers to sit silently and ponder the metaphysical possibilities of ice-related doom. This has created bizarre scenes of cars sitting motionless in parking lot exits, engines idling as their occupants attempt to project an aura of appropriate winter seriousness. If the rule continues evolving at this rate, drivers will eventually be required to say a few words of tribute to the frost before shifting into drive. 21. A famously overprepared northern town enacted a winter rule stating that every car must carry a bag of sand in the trunk, not for traction, but to demonstrate symbolic readiness for adversity, which is bureaucratic code for "we wanted to pass a law and ran out of sensible ideas." Residents now lug around heavy sacks that rattle ominously during lane changes, turning every commute into an accidental workout. One woman was fined because her sandbag was too decorative, featuring a floral pattern that apparently betrayed the severity winter deserves. Officers conduct trunk inspections with the solemnity of archaeologists verifying sacred relics, ensuring the sand meets texture standards and hasn't been replaced by cheaper materials like birdseed. The rule does nothing except fuel a thriving black market of aesthetically disappointing sandbags sold by local hardware stores that know exactly how silly this has become. 22. A lakeside community dealing with chronic ice implemented a law requiring drivers to announce their braking intentions to trailing vehicles through gentle hand motions, meaning motorists must roll down windows in freezing temperatures and wave like stressed flight attendants every time they slow down. One man attempted to use a puppet instead of his bare hand and was promptly cited for unauthorized signaling theatrics, which should be a comedy award, not a fine. Officers insist the rule improves communication, though it mostly improves everyone's risk of frostbite and humiliation. Drivers now choreograph their braking with cautious elegance, trying to appear both clear and dignified, while flurries whip into the car and turn their arm into a temporary snow sculpture. Winter driving already feels like a circus. This law simply makes the clown makeup metaphorical. 23. A city with a long history of micromanaging existence passed a rule stating that during winter, any car parked on a public street must angle its wheels toward the prevailing winds, as if vehicles are migratory birds needing aerodynamic alignment. Officers use handheld wind meters to determine whether a driver sufficiently respected the atmosphere while parallel parking. One man was fined because his wheels were angled toward yesterday's wind, a poetic yet infuriating concept suggesting the weather has a memory and expects loyalty. Residents now treat parking like astrology, checking forecasts to ensure their wheels honor wind direction with the appropriate spiritual commitment. The rule accomplishes absolutely nothing except providing meteorology students with part-time jobs and making winter feel like a collaborative art project between humans and nature that neither asked for. 24. A remote region created a winter rule forbidding drivers from using recirculated cabin air when temperatures drop below freezing, because the car must breathe fresh air to avoid stagnation. A scientific claim roughly on par with believing your toaster has opinions. Officers test compliance by placing cold mirrors inside vehicles and watching for fogging patterns, effectively turning drivers into unwitting participants in seasonal chemistry experiments. One woman protested that the fresh air was attempting to freeze her eyelashes to her forehead, but the officer simply reminded her that vehicles thrive on ventilation, as if her Subaru were a Victorian poet in need of open windows and inspiration. The rule's only measurable impact has been an epidemic of chattering teeth in drivers whose faces now resemble Renaissance paintings of stoic saints, enduring hardship they definitely didn't choose. 25. In a disturbingly earnest village, the winter driving code includes a rule requiring cars to flash their high beams twice before entering any rural road to warn potential wildlife of approaching civilization, which presumes deer appreciate polite scheduling notifications. Officers ticket drivers who fail to produce the correct pattern, scolding them for disrupting the interspecies contract, a phrase that suggests legal negotiations took place between humans and raccoons. One man received a citation because his warning flashes were too timid, implying the deer demanded confidence. Now drivers perform elaborate headlight salutes in the dark like they're trying to communicate with extraterrestrials rather than forest animals that spend most of winter actively ignoring everything. The whole process resembles a diplomatic ritual no one agreed to, but everyone is now forced to participate in to avoid fines and cosmic judgment. 26. A snow-prone municipality wrote a rule requiring drivers to recite the street name aloud before turning onto it during winter to reinforce navigational accountability, a concept that transforms rush hour into something between a guided meditation and a hostage negotiation with your GPS. Officers have ticketed people for mumbling, mispronouncing, or expressing insufficient verbal clarity, effectively forcing drivers to perform winter-themed spelling bees in their cars. One man was fined because he attempted to abbreviate a long street name, an act considered directionally disrespectful. The result is a city filled with drivers loudly announcing intersections like over-caffeinated bus operators, while pedestrians pretend this is normal. The rule might have been intended to prevent wrong turns, but its true legacy is transforming winter driving into a public speaking class no one asked to enroll in. 27. A frigid region passed a law requiring all vehicles to periodically shake off accumulated snow by controlled vibration, meaning drivers must briefly rev their engines to jiggle loose powder before it becomes a projectile hazard. Officers insist this mimics natural shedding behaviors, as if cars are hibernating animals preparing for migration. One driver was fined because his shake was performatively weak, which is a sentence that should only exist in interpretive dance critiques. Residents now practice their winter shivering rituals in empty parking lots, creating the absurd spectacle of cars quivering in unison like a cold metal chorus. The law's logic is questionable, but its entertainment value is undeniable, especially for officers who get to decide whether your vehicle's dance performance was emotionally convincing. 28. A region famous for relentless snowfall implemented a law requiring drivers to wear reflective vests whenever they exit their car during winter, not for actual visibility, but to maintain a uniform aesthetic of caution, which is less a safety measure and more a community cosplay requirement. Officers cite people for non-compliant winter attire as though mismatched outerwear represents a threat to civic order. The rule has created impromptu vest parades in grocery store parking lots, with residents shuffling around looking like construction workers who wandered off their job sites in slow, snowy confusion. One driver was fined because his vest was overly fashionable, which apparently violates the spirit of communal caution by being too confident. The rule hasn't improved safety, but has significantly enhanced the region's reputation as a place where winter turns everyone into high-visibility penguins. 29. A town with an unusually theatrical approach to governance created a winter rule demanding that drivers honk once before crossing any bridge if temperatures drop below freezing, to test the bridge's emotional readiness, according to the actual ordinance text. This has resulted in motorists performing what can only be described as polite beeps of encouragement at unsuspecting infrastructure. Officers listen for these honks, like proud stage directors, ensuring their performers hit their cues. One woman was fined for apathetic honking, which apparently means her beep lacked the emotional sincerity required to motivate the bridge. Residents now approach bridges with the seriousness of actors preparing monologues, hoping their horn conveys respect, urgency, and seasonal devotion. Winter is already dramatic. This law simply gives it an audience and a soundtrack. Winter driving may be chaos, but at least it's creatively stupid. Drop your pick for the dumbest rule in the comments. And if you survive this list, you know what to do.